2 days ago. Any news on when a memorial might be happening?
There won't be.
Won't be one? Okay.
Hi, Marissa, Jeff, Linda.
Hello.
Hello. Patty, hi.
Hi.
It's a party.
Yeah.
Kelly Sipe is still trying to join.
Yeah, her computer does something weird
Yeah.
sometimes.
Well, it's probably because the dog's been chewing on
Yeah.
the dog that sits on Brian's lap all the time. Hey, speaking about dogs.
Yeah, who's a dog? Oh, that's the Walker's
Sick 'em.
dog.
There's Danny in the back.
Oh, yeah.
He's got the blankie going. Oh, and Jeff's eating dinner still. I like it. Marissa, what does your t-shirt say? Or your sweater?
Mine?
Yeah. Oh, Willamette.
Willamette.
Yeah, the Bearcats.
Bearcats.
Yeah.
Only one other university I know of that has a Bearcat mascot, and that's Cincinnati.
Mr. Mark Nowak. Kelly's still trying to join.
My high school is Bearcats, and whenever we'd play away games, the other team would always yell, "What's a Bearcat?" every single time.
Really?
Pretty much without fail, yeah.
And you guys said
We didn't really have
no.
we didn't really have anything else to say. It's a mix between a bear and a cat. That's all.
Absolute funniest mascot I've ever heard of was some thing came through a Google News feed. A school for the deaf somewhere in the Midwest. Their mascot was the deaf leopard.
You know, when I was in Morro Bay, the high school there, it was the Morro Bay Otters. And I just thought, man, if you're trying to pick the most or the least intimidating mascot ever.
What about a cheesemaker? Yeah. Isn't that in the West? Who's the cheesemakers?
Wisconsin. There's a school in Wisconsin, I'm sure it's at.
Wow.
Right.
Those cheesemakers are scary.
Uh-huh.
Don't want to cross paths with them.
I always get to know during March Madness time, different those. Where do you find the Salukis? As a mascot.
I have no idea.
I know that one. There's the Tennessee Volunteers. I know that. The Salukis.
I don't even know how to spell that.
Oh, it sounds like a Greek sauce.
Greek sauce.
Great sauce.
It's actually a breed of dog.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Not a husky, it's a Saluki.
There you go.
Kelly Sipe made it on finally.
Look, there's a Saluki.
The white Saluki.
Get a light on over his head.
But why would the University of Irvine choose the anteater to be its
That's
mascot?
a good question.
Yeah.
They're ferocious.
Yeah, that ranks in there with the horn toad.
Yeah.
Horn toad.
Yeah, and if Bruce Carroll's on, I was talking to him this last week and him and his son, and of course everyone you probably know I have beaver problems in my pond and they eat our trees. So I told Bruce I've come up with a solution to keep the beavers out of my orchard. And he goes, "What was that?" I said, "I painted a goal line right along the pond edge.
Oh, yeah.
They'll never cross it."
I'll never get there. Yeah. I love it.
That football game this year sort of put a
Yeah,
kibosh
that's
on
right.
your joke.
Someone else told me that, and I thought it was kind of funny. So
That's funny.
Honestly, though, what's a duck gonna do? Just fly away when it
they
gets
just
scared?
fly over the line.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, of course.
I'll never get there.
We hear ourselves in the background on some of these
I
YouTube.
love it.
Football game.
Okay, I think we got it now. We're good.
Yeah. Steve's iPhone will admit him.
Are we
Well, I
back?
think the University of Idaho is the Vagrants.
Let me see. You got the
Vandals.
Idaho State Vandals and the
Vandals.
Vagrants?
That's it.
Yeah,
Vandals.
Vandals. Yeah.
And
And
that's
the other
interesting
one-
how they got that name.
Yeah. Well, a Vandal. Yeah. They're like a raider or something.
I like the Washington football team. That's a pretty creative name.
The
right there.
puppies.
No, the Washington football team. The
Oh, you mean
the
the
Washington
Oh, the
Redskins
Washington-
dropped their
Yeah,
name
yeah,
and they
yeah.
went by the football team.
Yeah.
That was their name the whole year. I thought that was
I
hilarious.
thought you were talking about the Huskies, the puppies.
Washington football team. That's so
I know
good.
it's like, aren't they waiting to come up with a new name?
Yeah, but honestly, the football team is an option they're considering
Oh,
keeping,
really?
which is really funny, I think.
Well, but that confuses the soccer fans because a lot of soccer teams are
Yeah.
called the football team.
That's true.
Yeah.
It depends on the culture, but yeah.
iPad de Craig.
Yeah.
Hola.
Mr. Steve's
Yeah.
iPhone. Well, Steve, you're on an iPhone today. That's different.
Yeah, I'm up in Washington, and they had some big power failure up in the hills, so Ben and Martha's stuff isn't working, so I had to get on my iPhone.
Yes.
You're at Martha's Vineyard, you said?
He said
No,
Martha.
Ben and Martha's house up in Washington.
Yeah, there's power outages all over the place in Washington, actually.
Well, ours went out twice last night.
Or yeah, well, I was gonna say north of town. I didn't teach classes today online because up in Jervis the power went out.
Really? So you had a vacation day.
Well, it was work days, grading and planning, that sort of thing, but didn't have to teach.
That lasted 10 minutes, huh?
Our power went out 4 times.
Well, it lasted more than 10 minutes because I don't have you as a student, Jack.
Ooh.
That was a great comeback.
No, if you had me correcting my papers would be A, 100%.
I don't think that's
Oh, you
what he
turned
was
them in?
had in mind.
Yeah. Well, yeah, if I don't turn them in, it makes it even quicker, doesn't
Yeah.
it? The husky ate it. No, the Slutski. Yeah.
Saluki.
Saluki.
Anyways,
I'm looking for my wife. She's not on yet. Can someone call her and tell her to get on?
that's your job.
Let's see how many calls she can get. That'd be fun. And just a reminder.
Just a sec, Zach.
What's that?
How could I not hear you? But I'm in the middle of listening to something when they were on.
People
No,
are
I
calling.
don't. They won't work.
He said Brian's calling her.
Here, I'll mute Steve. That way we're not eavesdropping on
By
us.
the way, it's the Southern Illinois Salukis.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, now Ann Hafer, she must have gotten a call.
Yep.
Oh, she came on. Hi, dear wife. All right. Well, it's 7:00. So we're going to have Brad say a opening prayer. And I was talking to Patty Runner. She's with us tonight too. She just found out that her mother
Not
passed.
Patty Runner.
Patty Tipton. Sorry.
Tipton.
That would have been terrible. Patty Tipton, her mother passed away 3 days ago, and she just found out about it. So she's asking for our prayers on her behalf and the family's
What
behalf.
just happened to his voice?
Our heart goes out to you, Patty, and we're sorry. And so Brad's going to include that in our opening prayer, and then we'll jump into our class.
It's a couple people that did catch it.
Your sound is a little bit off,
Yeah, you
guys.
guys just went bye-bye in the sound.
Yes.
We can hear you, but it's distant.
Oh, that's because it just turned off.
Something happened on the sound.
I think you're just on a computer mic instead of your actual microphone.
No, we're all right.
You hear us now?
There you go. That's better.
Yeah, that's better.
For some reason, our soundboard turned off. I was just saying, since you guys obviously couldn't hear that, Patty Tipton's mom passed away a couple days ago, so she's asking for prayers, and that's what Jack was just saying. So did you guys hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got
And
that.
so Brad's going to open us in a prayer and remember
Yeah.
her.
And are there any other prayer requests before we get started?
Well, she didn't pass away 2 days ago. She passed away last June. She found out 3 days ago.
Oh, okay.
Wow.
Wow.
Oh, well, I misunderstood. I thought she just found out 3 days ago. All right, Patty, I'm sorry. It was last June. Is that correct?
But
Correct.
Yeah, it was last June, but she did just find out a couple days ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's just complicated. So let's just keep her in our prayers. And
Wow.
right, let's go to God in prayer.
Yep.
Heavenly Father, we come before you this evening, gathering with the blessings of the technology that you've given us. Asking you to be with this gathering as we look at your word and study and see what you would have for us to do and to act and how to think. We ask you to be with Patty this night as she's heard some disturbing news this week about her mother and that issue, but please be with her, strengthen her, show her your loving kindness in the ways only you can. Please be with us all as we head into this new year, that we can use the opportunities we are given to show you to the world. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right. In a second, Jack's going to have a couple slides to show that'll kind of give put us in the setting of where we're going to be studying tonight. But we're going to be in Judges chapter 9, and we're kind of doing a little bit of a departure from what we typically do. The plan was kind of initially to do a character study of all the judges. That's still true. That's still what we're doing. However, we look at Abimelech, and Abimelech is going to be the son of Gideon. And Abimelech, the reality is he ends up being a leader, not a very good leader, but he does end up being a leader. However, one of the main kind of qualifications, if you will, of a judge, and we kind of established this in the very first class, was that a judge had to be anointed by God. And so we read kind of constantly about these judges that were raised up by God. And so Abimelech comes onto the scene, and he's not acting as a judge. He's not acting as a deliverer, but he becomes somebody that has a passion and a hunger for power, and is really just seeking out his own self-interest. And we're going to see that Abimelech is the son of Gideon and a concubine from Shechem. And so you might recall last week we ended talking about Gideon, and we look at his, we spent 4 weeks talking about Gideon and how impressive that he was. However, towards the end of his kind of reign, if you will, as a deliverer, as a judge, he makes one really big mistake. Does anybody remember what it was that Gideon did towards the end of his life that kind of puts Israel on a bad path? Anybody remember what it was?
Made an ephod.
Yeah, he makes
right.
that ephod. Welcome back, Steve. Looked like we lost you for a second. Sorry. Yeah, he makes that ephod, which an ephod was simply something that, the high priest would have worn. And so it's kind of this garment that was associated with religious practices. Now, we don't know exactly what Gideon's original intentions were with that. All we know is that it says really boldly that Israel whored after it. Now, that was the one big mistake that Gideon made at the end of his life. However, one that we didn't really talk about is that he also ends up amassing for himself many wives. And with that, as a consequence, naturally, he has many sons.
It's mentioned there were 70 altogether.
Yeah, so he ends up having 70 sons. And, in a culture back then, doesn't that say something? Wasn't there sometimes a reason why somebody would go out and have a lot of wives and have a lot of sons?
It's probably a pride issue and showed that you were, you had to have fortune to afford it, but it showed
Statement of pride and wealth.
Right.
Yeah, it was a sign of wealth, because if you have all these people you have to take care of and you're doing it, then obviously you have a lot of money. It was a way to flex your muscles, so to speak. But having 70 sons, I joked with Jack earlier, I had 2 brothers, and we fought all the time. So having 70 sons, it kind of just breeds the possibility of division, and really increases the chances of, children getting neglected and being treated unfairly, and therefore growing up not to be very good individuals.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we see in Abimelech, as he kind of conspires with these people of Shechem. And it's said that Shechem at this point would have been just, probably a colony, a city of Canaanites, not covenant people. This is where his mother was from. and he
that,
ends up.
and that reference
Yeah.
is in chapter 8, verse 31. And I'll just read it real
Go
quick.
ahead.
His concubine who was in Shechem also bore him a son, and he named him Abimelech. And so
Yeah.
this is where we're introduced to him. And the whole chapter now is going to be about this man who, as you said, is not a judge, but it shows really the antithesis. When you don't follow God, and of course God's delivered, this is the other way it goes, where man takes over and it's just going to be evil.
Yeah, and so I titled this class, and kind of the theme of Abimelech is the king we deserve. Now I say that a little bit tongue in cheek, but we look at Jesus. Obviously, we have a great king in Jesus. That's the obvious. That's understating the obvious. But we don't deserve Jesus. I mean, our sinfulness, our pride, and yet it's by the grace of God that he sent his son to rule over us and give us that chance. The type of king we deserve is somebody probably like Abimelech. And we could say the same thing about Saul. The people wanted a king, and they got the king that they asked for in Saul, and it ended up being a problem for them. And so we look at somebody like Abimelech, and he's going to seize power, and he's just he's just so far, just complete night and day contrast between the king that we have in Jesus. And I think that'll just become really obvious as we read about him.
And let's reinforce what he says. We get what we deserve. Well, Israel did, because again, in verse 33 of chapter 8, they played the harlot again with the Baal. They made this temple to Baal Berith in Shechem. In verse 34, they didn't remember the Lord who had delivered them from the hands of their enemies. That they didn't show kindness to the household Jerubbabel. So when you leave God, you're going to get a person like Abimelech.
Yep.
Right.
And so I guess one quick thing I want to share as well, kind of interesting, at the end of Gideon's reign, the people were begging that he would reign over them. And he said, I won't reign over you. The Lord will reign over you. And the name Abimelech, it means my father, the king, or my father is king, which is kind of interesting. Did Gideon change, or was it saying that God, my father is king? I don't know. It's kind of an interesting name. But we're going to see that Abimelech, either way, he has this strong desire to live up to that name and to be a king himself. And he uses Shechem to accomplish that. And I know you have some pictures and some things to share.
Let's introduce what Shechem's all about, because it's really central to the history of Israel. And it's not, I don't think it's obvious. It's not a coincidence. There's nothing a coincidence here of why this all takes place in Shechem. And so when we look at Shechem, it's a north west of Jerusalem. It's in the tribal area of Manasseh. And when you look at it a little closer, you're going to see that it's sandwiched between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And could ask, but just for time's sake, because we have a lot of history happened here. When Abraham was given the promise of a great nation, and through his seed, all nations be blessed, he set up an altar to worship God. It was at Shechem. When Jacob left and fled to go up north because his brother's trying to kill him, and then returned and made an altar to God, it was at Shechem, where he called it El Elohil Israel. In other words, God, Jehovah, the God of Israel. Yeah. I butchered that one. All right. And it was here that Joshua had all the tribes of Israel, when they moved into the land of Canaan. Half were on Mount Ebal and half on Mount Gerizim. And he read all the book of the law, the blessings and the curse, where they promised to keep it then. Then in Joshua 24, he set up a witness stone before he died and said, choose this day whom you're going to serve. And they said, well, we'll serve the Lord. So why does that keep happening? I don't know.
Thanks, Brad.
That is really maybe kicking us. And so when you look at this picture, here is modern day.
Sorry, for some reason our sound goes out, and I don't know. We'll have to keep an eye on that. Thanks for letting us know, Brad.
Here is modern day Nablus, and it's Arab controlled or Palestinian, and Mount Gerizim's on the southern side, and then Mount Ebal's on the northern side. And here's an aerial view if you want to look at it. And here is the archaeological dig where Shechem was. And what's really interesting, because when you look at that site, there on this round stone here or area is where the witness stone is, and right behind it is the temple to Bel. And it's the same temple that we read about in Judges chapter 9 that Abimelech is going to get his funding to wage his war from. And so when we look a little closer, there's Joshua's witness stone. It's broken in half, and they put it there. They found it, and they think pretty with some certainty that this is the stone that he set up in Joshua 24. And then right behind it is this fortress temple, Baal Bereth, that we're going to be reading about, that the people turn to worship this God. So on one hand, look at the contrast, a witness stone to the fact that we said we're going to obey God, the blessing and the curse, we accept it. And then right next to it is a Baal idol. And it's in this place where this son of Gideon, through a concubine, is going to take over Israel as king. All right.
Yep. All right. And so just in case people missed some of that, because I know our sound cut out, not really sure how long it was, but what Jack was just kind of sharing with us there is kind of the layout of the land of Shechem, where a lot of these events that we're going to be reading about take place. And this is really where Abimelech probably spent some of his childhood growing up. And this is his own countrymen as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share screen if you don't mind.
Get out of mine.
Thanks.
There we go.
And sorry about that. It's always kind of funny. Hold on a second.
And we'll get some affirmation that you can all see it.
Oh, that's why.
Somebody?
Yeah. Hold on.
We see it.
All right, good.
Sorry. I got like all these windows to close. There we go. Sorry, I couldn't pull it up on my screen. All right, and so let me just advance a couple slides and catch up to where we're at here. But so here's what kind of the outline of this text is going to be. We look at Abimelech, and again, he's rising using the land of Shechem, and so there's going to be a conspiracy in order for him to take control of kind of a portion of Israel. But then when we see people coming together and conspiring, when we see movements that are born out of immoral violence, and when we see a throne established on deceit and dishonesty and disloyalty, we're going to find that whoever it is that's conspiring, if those are the types of characteristics they have, it's inevitably going to lead to bad things. I mean, it's inevitable that they're going to turn on each other. And so that's what we're going to see with Abimelech as he conspires with Shechem. Eventually, they're going to turn on each other, and it's not going to be good for either side. And so that's why the third thing we'll look at is we'll look at the ruin. We'll look at the ruin that's left behind, not only by Abimelech, but Abimelech himself is going to be ruined, and it has everything to do with these sinful actions and these sinful steps that he takes in the verses that we're going to be reading.
That's why some people, as we see this, they look at it as a chapter of divine retribution. Because when you try to rise up against God, it's all going to come back down on your own head.
Yeah, that's right. And so here's Abimelech, and we'll just go ahead and I'll pick up and I'll read in verse 1 and 2 real quick. But it says, "Now Abimelech, the son of Jerubbaal, went to Shechem to his mother's relatives and said to them, to the whole clan of his mother's family, say in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, which is better for you, that all 70 of the sons of Jerubbaal rule over you, or that one rule over you? Remember also that I am your bone and I am your flesh." And so we see Abimelech, and he's really already a pretty polished politician, if you will. And, you know, like all good leaders, they're able to manipulate and say the things that they need to say in order to sway people to follow them. And so there's a couple things that kind of stick out to me that he says that kind of gains the favor of Shechem. And one of them is going to kind of expose, I think, where Shechem is coming from and what their mindset is. But the first one that Abimelech does is he paints, when he says this, he's going to be painting his brothers. That's who these 70 men are.
And they'd be stepbrothers.
They'd be stepbrothers, but he paints them in a negative light. He paints them and shows them to be enemies as he's presenting them and presenting these ideas to the people of Shechem, and basically giving them an option that I'm not even sure is really a scenario that exists. And he's essentially saying, look, what do you want? Do you want 70 people to be ruling over you that aren't of your countrymen? Or do you want just one of these people to be ruling over you? And when he says they're sons of Jerubbaal, we remember what that name means.
Contend with Baal.
Yeah,
Let Baal contend.
And that was Gideon's other name, right? And so as he's talking to Shechem, Shechem worshipped who?
Baal. So
they worship Baal. So do you want to be ruled by somebody who's known by the sons of him who contends with Baal? Or do you want to be ruled by me? So this is the first thing that he says. He kind of sets them up as enemies. And again, that's what all wicked leaders do. They're masters at manipulation, and they're masters at making other people look bad. But the other thing he does is he sympathizes with them by, using what they have in common. And so he says, remember also, I am your bone and your flesh. And so he's appealing to the fact that they are relatives. And I think the reason why that's going to be so persuasive for Shechem is because, well, if Abimelech's in charge, what does that mean for them?
Yeah, they have some control themselves.
They have some power themselves because he's a relative of ours. He's related to us, and he's from our own countrymen. And so we'd rather have our countrymen in charge rather than the sons of Jerubbaal. And so we continue reading here, unless you have something to add there, Jack.
Oh, that's good.
So we continue reading in verse 4, and I'll read that. But it says his mother's relatives spoke all these words on his behalf in the ears of all the leaders of Shechem, and their hearts inclined to follow Abimelech. For they said, he is our brother, and they gave him 70 pieces of silver out of the house of Baal Berith, with which Abimelech hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. So this, again, it's interesting to me. First off, I doubt anybody's going to know, but anybody have any idea what the phrase Baal Berith means? I told Jack earlier. Does Jack remember? Baal Berith means Lord of the Covenant. And I think that is very interesting that they're worshiping a god, and they're worshiping somewhere at a house of worship known as the Lord of the Covenant, which, by the way, you had really covenant conversation going on with Joshua, as you have Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and all these things were being established. Well, this is where they set up a temple, and they called it Baal Berith, which is Lord of the Covenant. This is how they understood their God, and I don't know what to make of that. It seems like it's a direct challenge to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Did they picture Baal as being the God of the covenant? I think it paints a picture of how far gone Israel has gotten at this point spiritually.
And how quickly.
From
just Gideon's. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it says that they gave him 70 pieces of silver. This is from, pagan worship. And he hired worthless and reckless fellows who followed him. And that also is interesting when it comes to leadership. Is it fair to say, Jack, that whoever we follow is going to have some sort of direct impact on us?
Yeah, you're going to attract the similar people to who you are, and they're going to become like you. And, evil begets evil, and that's exactly what's happening here.
Yeah.
And it's going to take that kind of people to do his work as well.
Yeah, we become whoever it is that we follow, whoever it is that we idolize, whoever it is that we look up to. If you look up to somebody enough and you start following them, you're going to become a reflection of that leader. And that's also, I think, that goes both ways. That can be a good thing and it can be a bad thing, and it all depends on what.
Who
you're following.
Let me just read Romans 6,
Yeah.
because this really applies to us as Christians, because everyone's going to follow someone.
Mhm.
We become like Christ. But Paul says this in Romans 6, verse 16. Do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves the one you obey? You're going to either result in death or obedience resulting in righteousness. And it's just two different directions. Of course, we already get a preview what's going to happen now to these people. It's going to be death. But yes.
Yeah. And so just to kind of remind people, and I'll ask this question, who is it? What is it that Jesus says that it's enough? Is Jesus is the master? He's the teacher. It's enough for the student to be what? It's enough for the student, he tells his disciples, to be what?
Matthew chapter 10.
Yeah, Matthew 10. Anybody got that? Jesus tells his disciples it's enough for a student to be what? No, I hear somebody's about to talk. Somebody got it? No? Jesus says in Matthew 10 and verse 24 through 25, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. It is enough for the disciple to be like his teacher and the servant like his master. So I bring that verse up just to kind of illustrate the point that we become what we follow. And that's true of these men that are following Abimelech. They're going to become everything that Abimelech is, and they're just a reflection of who Abimelech is. But it's also the same, and it's supposed to be the same with Christians, that the idea is that we want to become who we're following, and that's Jesus, and it's enough to be like him. We're not trying to be more than him, and we don't want to be less than him. We want to be conformed to the image of his son. And so we see the bad side of that in Judges chapter 9 and verse 4. And so we keep reading, and in verse 5, it says, let me advance my slides, sorry. It says that he went to his father's house at Ophrah and killed his brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal, 70 men on one stone. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, was left, for he hid himself. So what does it mean when it says that they were killed on one stone?
Yeah. You know, they say that this would be a stone where they butchered cattle. So it was a place. So this was organized and orchestrated.
Yeah.
And again, it shows how evil he was. And just notice that there's going to be contrast. What he does is going to come back to him. So remember this idea of stone, because we're going to see at the end of the chapter, stone and death.
And so this wasn't in the heat of war. This wasn't in the heat of battle. This is, a coup in every sense of the word. And you have Abimelech conspiring with Shechem and murdering his own brothers in this organized fashion. Perhaps they did it one by one, but they really put him on display and just murdered his own brothers in cold blood. And that should give you an idea of just how wicked Abimelech is. I mean, to kill his own brothers. Yeah, they're stepbrothers, but they're still his own brothers. And the fact that he did it and just seems to have no second thoughts about it, I think really tells you not only how wicked he is, but how wicked the people are that are following him. And the fact that they want to select him and choose him to be their king. And that's exactly what they do in the next verse. It says, all the leaders of Shechem came together, all Beth Milo, and they went and made Abimelech king by the oak of the pillar at Shechem. So you, I think, mentioned the oak of the pillar at Shechem earlier.
Yeah, and that's where Joshua placed a copy of the law. And so the contrast is amazing that here it's the same area in the same place where they all agreed, Israel, to obey God and not follow man and not get involved in idolatry. There's no indication of how much all of Israel accepted this kingship, but certainly this chapter is going to deal with his reign and his terror, actually. So
yeah. And anyways, I just think that that's interesting that they're setting him up to be king right next to a place where they had set up this memorial that would be a witness to generations of the covenant that they made. Yeah. And so they conspire together. Anybody have any comments or questions before we move on to the next section?
Just your comments about leadership made me think of the line from I mentioned this to you a few weeks before, I think, from Remember the Titans, the movie.
Oh yeah.
When the two captains, one black, one white, was having trouble, and Julius says to the other guy, attitude reflects leadership.
Yep. And it trickles down to everybody, Yeah, it has an effect all the way around, doesn't it? So you look at these people conspiring together, and again, I think it's just natural when you have people coming together with wicked intentions to overthrow, somebody good. that's not going to work out for anyone. And maybe we see this in really practical ways when you got two people coming together to gossip and tarnish the reputation of someone else that doesn't deserve that, of course. Well, we shouldn't expect anything other than that person that we're gossiping with is going to at some point talk behind our back as well. It's just what these people do sometimes. And so that's that's kind of an analogy, I think, of what we see with Abimelech and his relationship with Shechem. And we're going to see that they end up dividing. This is not a happy marriage. And by the way, Abimelech is the first ever king in Israel. I mean, technically speaking, it's not that he's anointed by God. We always think of Saul, but here Abimelech is, and he's just overthrowing, and he's wicked, and he sets himself up in this position to be king, just an extremely wicked person. And so all his brothers are murdered except for one, and his name's Jotham. And Jotham, he's going to issue a warning that's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll have Jack read through it.
Yeah, and he goes up to Mount Gerizim, and that's where, again, the people gathered not too long ago when they all agreed to follow God's law. So he goes up to Mount Gerizim and cries out, "Listen to me, O men of Shechem, that God may listen to you." And he tells it it's like a fable, and some people call it, but it's a story. It's really intriguing because it's going to apply to them. He said, "Once the trees went forth to anoint a king over them, and they said to the olive tree, 'Reign over us.'" So imagine trees talking to an olive tree. And but the olive tree said to them, "Shall I leave my fatness with which God and men are honored and go to wave over the trees, give them shade?" Then the tree said to the fig tree, these are trees that were very prominent in Israel's day and provided them sustenance and wealth. And the tree said to the fig tree, "You come, reign over us." So verse 11, the fig tree said, "Shall I leave my sweetness and my good fruit and go to wave over the trees?" So then the tree said to the vine, that would be the grapevine, same thing, "Reign over us." And he said, "Shall I leave my new wine, which cheers God and men, and go to wave over the trees?" So finally come to a bramble. What would that be?
NIV calls it a thorn bush. That's probably pretty accurate.
Like a blackberry vine, just something that's nasty and not very tall. The leaves aren't going to provide much shade. And they said, "Come, reign over us." Obviously, this is going to be a reference to Abimelech, right? So the bramble said to the trees, "If in truth you're anointing me as king over you, come and take refuge in my shade. But if not, may fire come out from the bramble and consume the cedars of Lebanon."
So it's just kind of interesting. Obviously, as you already pointed out, we look at all those trees, they, produce something good. Then we get to the bramble, which represents Abimelech. What does that say about Abimelech? And what does that say maybe about his relationship with Shechem at this time? What's the message Jotham's trying to get across, do you guys think? And go ahead and feel free to comment and unmute yourselves if you want. Why would Abimelech be compared to a bramble? Quiet tonight.
Yeah.
It has a lot of stickers on it. So he's kind of being a pain.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anybody else? I think the key to notice is that you look at all those other things. You got an olive tree.
Nothing good will come from him.
There you go. I think what Ann said is accurate. I think also what Brian said. Sorry, but I think what Brian said is accurate. That all those three trees that are mentioned before the bramble, they produce something. Olive tree. I mean, as Jack said, all these trees are very valuable to Israel. Fig tree, vine, that produced wine, and they use that. A bramble doesn't really produce anything. And that's what's being said about Abimelech, that he's not producing anything, and you're going to establish him as your king. And I think it's also interesting in this parable. Do you guys find it ironic that a bramble is offering shade to trees? What's kind of the messaging going on there? What's he trying to get across? What's the warning?
not capable of it because it's low growing and the trees are tall.
Yeah. And I just think that that is so appropriate and something to remember, that we can end up following people based off of empty promises that they're making. The moment somebody starts telling us everything that we want to hear, we should immediately be hesitant, because just because somebody is saying something and promising something doesn't mean that they're actually going to be able to, cash that check, so to speak. And that's Abimelech. He's making promises that he can't keep. And I also find it interesting that in this parable, when the trees are getting shade from the bramble, he ends up basically, it describes him as threatening these trees not to leave him. And if you do, bad things are going to happen. I mean, do you see the contrast between this king and our king, Jesus? One threatens you if you leave. The other warns you if you leave, and says, you won't be safe if you leave me. That's Jesus. This one's saying, if you leave, I'm going to turn my anger against you. I'm going to lash out at you. And that's the type of leadership that we're going to see Abimelech provides, is one that lashes out the moment that they do something he doesn't want them to do, the moment that maybe they, disagree with his leadership style or something of that nature. And either way, Jotham makes it really clear what he means by this. He interprets it himself.
And it's a strong warning.
Yeah.
They're going to end up turning on you, like you said.
And I actually have in verse 20, I meant to put it on the slide, but Jotham says, if you didn't establish him as your king in good faith, which obviously they didn't because they murdered a bunch of people. I think that's obvious. He says, so if not, let fire come from Abimelech and devour the leaders of Shechem. This is verse 20. And Beth Milo, and let fire come out from the leaders of Shechem and from Beth Milo and devour Abimelech. And so the prediction that Jotham makes is what? In verse 20.
They're going to kill each other.
Yeah.
Eventually here.
They're going to turn on each other, which is exactly what we talked about. They conspire together. They're going to turn on each other. And so there's division between Abimelech and Shechem. Somebody had to have a comment. I thought I heard somebody about to talk. No? Okay. And so we keep reading, and in verse 23, we see that God, he's behind some of this that's going on. He's not going to look at, 70 of these people that were sons of Gideon. Gideon served him well, for all intents and purposes. I mean, he was a faithful servant of God, with the exception of some decisions at the end. And so he's not going to let this go unpunished. And so it's interesting, in verse 23, it said God sent an evil spirit. Some translations say a spirit of ill will. I think NIV says he stirred up animosity. That's really the idea of what's going on here. God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech and the leaders of Shechem, and the leaders of Shechem dealt treacherously with Abimelech. And so kind of going through this relatively quickly, because we're not able to read all the text.
And I encourage everyone to read this to see how it happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. But from here, things are just bad between Abimelech and the people of Shechem. And in fact, they turn on him completely. And they have this huge party where they're making wine and getting drunk, and they're publicly reviling Abimelech. Abimelech is their king, and they're publicly reviling him. And they find this other man named Gaal, who's, from Shechem. He's, so to speak, a purebred Shechemite. His blood isn't diluted with that blood of Gideon, I think is probably what they're thinking. And it says that they were entrusting Gaal, and Gaal ends up publicly challenging Abimelech. He says, get your gear ready and come out. And Abimelech ends up hearing of it. And from here, Abimelech, he's going to ambush Shechem.
They were going to ambush Abimelech. And so he hears about it. And so he sets a counter ambush. And it's just interesting. He who lives by the sword is going to die by the sword.
Yeah. And so this is interesting. And Judges chapter 9, verse 34, we're just kind of skipping ahead here. It says, Abimelech and all the men who were with him rose up by night and set an ambush against Shechem in 4 companies. And so what you basically see from there, because again, we don't have time to read all the text, is that they are extremely successful in this ambush. And when I say they, I mean Abimelech and his men are successful in this ambush against Shechem. But again, I'll ask this question. Is there anything ironic about this? Could you say that this was a successful campaign for Abimelech? Well, in one sense, you'd say yes, because he defeated them. But when you take a step back, you say no, because these are the people he's supposed to be king of.
They're supposed to be support.
I mean, if he destroys enough of them, what's left to be a king of? And so he kills all these people that he was supposed to be the ruler of. And then to take things even further, in verse 45, it says Abimelech fought against the city all that day. He captured the city and killed the people who were in it, and he razed the city and sowed it with salt. So what does it mean when it says that he sowed it with salt?
So that's really making the ground infertile. It's sterile. It can't bear any fruit. You can't plant wheat or anything.
Yeah. And so what's
It's
that?
useless.
Yeah. It makes the city completely useless. By doing this, you're completely destroying the city. So it's one thing you could say from a king's standpoint, okay, the people were conspiring against me, so that's treason, and he killed them. But it's another thing to also completely soil or spoil the land in the process and make it useless. And I think it just is a lesson of how volatile and how poisonous pride can be in our lives. You just become completely illogical. And it's interesting. I think with sin, we have the tendency, and I think it's Satan, he tricks us into thinking that when I sin, somehow I'm getting something out of it, that I'm serving myself. But in the long run, what is it that sin does?
It destroys you.
It destroys yourself. And so you can think about, maybe drugs or anything. It makes me feel good, but in the long run, it kills me. I think that's the case that we see here with Abimelech and pride, that he's doing things that maybe satisfy his anger in the moment or maybe prove a point in the moment. But in the long run, they don't serve his purposes of wanting to be king. He's completely destroyed the land that he's king of by sowing salt in it and making it uninhabitable and unable to bear any crops. And so
going back to where you started, you get the king that you deserve. From their point of view, what else would they expect? Here's a guy that murdered his own brother so he could take rule, and they feel safe with him. Now he's murdering them. Yeah. What else did they expect? They're getting exactly what they asked for, the kind of king that they deserve.
So I think of Proverbs 16 and verse 18. It says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Whenever I read that verse, I always think of my own destruction. But I think the reality of that verse is it's much bigger than that. It looks a lot like what we see with Abimelech, that when we have pride, we don't only destroy ourselves, but we'll end up destroying everything around us as well. We're just like a tornado, like a ball of anger that's just going to run over anything that gets in our way. That's what you see with Abimelech, and he's not able to see how it even affects his own self as well. And so he becomes power hungry. Anybody have any comments or questions before we look at, again, the next section?
I don't see in this text any mention of anybody who was calling on God or looking for wise advice from God. Is just this big example in Judges of how wrong it can be if you have a king, and then not long after that, they ask for one. It's like a precursor to all the bad things that can happen if you have a king, and if you don't have somebody in power who is looking to God.
Mm-hmm. And that's a really good observation. And I just want to draw your attention back to verse 23 and 24, which Sam mentioned, where God sent an evil spirit or animosity between the two. Verse 24, we see God's still in charge, because he said he did this so that the violence done to the 70 sons of Jerubbaal might come and their blood might be laid on Abimelech. God's going to have retribution. Mm-hmm. And so he's still in charge. Even these people are acting by their own will with no acknowledgement of God at all. Yeah. Exactly right.
And so I think it's important too. He ends up chasing these people into a tower and burning down the tower. And then from there, again, it's like he's just seeing red. He's on a
Yeah, in
a
verse
military
49, it said
campaign.
1,000 men and
Yep.
women. The end. That's just cruel. They're burned.
Yep. Yep. And so he goes to another city, Thebez, and he encamps against it, and he's ready to attack it. And it looks like the battle goes the same way, except this time they lock themselves up in a strong tower, and kind of the similar situation that we just read. It's almost identical. And so you have all these people that are locking themselves in this tower. And then Judges 9 and verse 53, it says a certain woman, we don't know who, just a certain woman, threw an upper millstone on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. You got to love the women of Judges, don't you? I mean,
Yeah,
you got
really.
one that puts a spike through a skull. You got Deborah, and now you have this woman, and she puts an end to Abimelech with a millstone.
His terror and everything. And remember, he used a stone to kill his brothers, and now this stone, is it randomly hits him? I mean, good aim or God's behind it? You have to answer that yourself. But it crushes his head, but he's not dead yet.
And in fact, he actually asked for a young man to put the sword through him because.
Let's read that real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think in verse 54.
Mhm.
So he calls quickly to the young man, his armor's bearer, and said to him, draw your sword and kill me. Why? So it will not be said of me, a woman slew him. That's pride again.
Mhm.
So the young man pierced him through and he died. So the men of Israel saw that Abimelech was dead and each departed to his home.
Yeah. So what is he worried about when he's dying? I mean, he's been mortally wounded, and what is it that he's worried about?
His image.
Yeah, his image, his reputation. He's worried about how he's going to be remembered, and there's bigger things for him to worry about in that moment. And it tells you just how prideful he really was. I think you might have the verse.
Well, in 1 Samuel, we read that it's even quoted. It wasn't Abimelech who died at the hands of women. So everything that he tried to avoid, that's
still
how he's
happened.
remembered
He's
for.
remembered as dying at the hands of a woman.
And that's God's divine retribution. And it's interesting. He's trying to set fire. Remember the fable, let fire come out. Well, actually, amidst the fire, he found his own death.
Yep. And so, I think that the writer Judges points out the irony that in verse 56 and verse 57, thus God returned the evil of Abimelech, which he committed against his father in killing his 70 brothers. And God also made all the evil of the men of Shechem return on their heads. That's intentional, I think. And upon them came the curse of Jotham, the son of Jerubbaal. And so that's kind of the story of Abimelech. I know we kind of blazed through that. We actually got done a little bit early, but we're pretty good. But I guess that, again, what I want us to see with Abimelech is just the contrast. Maybe Abimelech gives us a glimpse into the king that maybe we deserve sometimes in our sinfulness, in our unrighteousness.
You don't want him.
But fortunately, God sent the king we didn't deserve, and the king that we desperately needed, and that's Jesus. And so that's what we have for you guys tonight. Again, I know that was a lot of information. Go ahead and unmute your mics if you have any comments or questions. Love to hear from you.
But I really appreciate this lesson because it shows when you turn away from God, what are you left with? Men like Abimelech, men of the world. And there's some better ones than others, but generally this is what you're going to get. So
I think the story of Kings, we learn that, I mean, there's even the good ones, they fell short. Yeah. And I think that's what the whole book of Kings points to, is that it's not enough to have a great king. You need a perfect king.
Very good. Oh. All right. So everybody can unmute themselves, their video, and also their mics, and anything you want to add or share, that's fine.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
Ann was going to say something. What were you going to say?
When I was reading this earlier today, I found it extremely confusing, trying to make sense out of it. What's it in there for? And it's, I thought maybe somebody's existence is merely to serve as a bad example,
Yeah, we asked that question too, and that's a great question to ask. Well, why is this long chapter in the book of Judges when he wasn't a judge, he wasn't a deliverer? And I think it shows in remember the theme that when there was no king in the land, everyone did what was right or in their own eyes or
Right.
evil. There is a king, it's Jehovah, but they didn't recognize his authority in their life. And so when there's a void or a vacuum, you can't exist in a vacuum. Someone's going to step in and fill that vacuum. And that's what you get is Abimelech. And I think God's demonstrating for us that when you don't honor him, you're going to have to turn to something else. And people like Abimelech are going to step forward. You don't want them.
I
You don't
think-
want them.
Jack, I think it's also a reminder for us that God is always in control.
Yes.
You know, no matter how bad it seemed with Abimelech and killing the 70 brothers, God still was in control. He was going to make things right in the end.
Yeah. And it didn't take long. Does anyone remember reading through here? Since we didn't mention it, good trivia question. How many years he reigned, Abimelech?
Ugh.
Oh, that's a good.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that.
Oh, that's
one.
right. They should see who read the text
Three
today.
3 years.
3
3
years.
years,
That's
yeah.
verse
3 years.
22,
Whoa.
right? Wasn't
Yeah.
very long, did it?
But it did
Last.
take some time for things to come to a head, I guess. Yeah.
Mhm.
You know, I was looking at this text, and to me, when I was reading it, it's almost like maybe gives you a small glimpse into what was going on, you know, during the times of Genesis 6, where there's just evil in man's heart continually.
Yeah.
And you almost get a little glimpse of that just in this sliver of the world in Israel. I mean, here's a people that made a covenant with God. They made a covenant with God, and this is what's going on in just in that country alone. I mean, you got a guy killing his own brothers, and then the people that he uses to kill his own brothers are turning on him, and so he turns on them, and then the lady smashing his head with the millstone. And I think, again, what it underscores is just where we get without God. And by the time you get to the end of Judges, it paints a very ugly picture. But I think God has, I'm thankful God gives us an example of that. And it's almost like he's letting human beings say, okay, I'll let you try it for a while. I'll let you take the wheel and let's see how that works out. And if we're ever curious about how that works out, we can open up our Bibles to the book of Judges.
And I think it helps us define too, when Joshua's told, do not let the law depart from you. Don't turn to the right or left, because every little step, one way or the other, leads to this type of event taking place. And you say, how do you get from following God to Baal worship? Well, it's just that first step to the right or the left. And it just reemphasizes that God's not just trying to control you. It's about truth, and it's about honoring, and you reap what you sow. I like what it said that you read in verse 56. God repaid the wickedness of Abimelech. You always reap what you sow eventually.
And
There's no
can I just,
escaping.
on that, Jack, I just want to segue off of what you said, because Hebrews 10, 30 says, and we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay.
Yeah.
And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God.
Yeah. So that's where we have to always talk about the loving kindness of God, but the judgment of God. They go hand in hand, and you can't have one without the other. And it's a terrifying thing to fall into God's
and
hands. It's
how-
the most blessed thing to fall into his loving hands.
How could God properly love, the sons of Gideon without doing something about these people that committed this atrocity against those men?
Good
You know what
point.
I'm saying? And
Yeah, he avenged their death. Yeah.
Sam,
yeah,
when I finished reading the chapter, I was overcome with, we're no different today. Things are the same today. The people's behavior towards one another.
Yeah.
Yes.
it is.
That's the mankind. The history of it's full of it.
Mhm.
You know.
Well, isn't it Peter and I forget the first thing Peter talks about, don't regard the slowness of God, don't regard God's patience as slowness or that he's forgotten. I'm paraphrasing greatly.
Yeah.
Right.
I know.
Yeah.
But he's wanting all men to come to repentance. And we are so in the here and now that, I didn't get judged or nothing bad happened to me when I did this one time. And we do it again, do it again, do it again. Nothing bad's happening. Do it again, do it again. Then sometime down the road, the bad thing, it comes due.
Yeah, I bet that Abimelech felt pretty good when he overthrew that first city in Shechem, and then he went on to Thebez, and his head gets crushed by a millstone. You know. And,
Yeah.
Rock on.
I mean, it sounds pretty bad, but as I tell some students sometimes when they're really behind on their work or something like that, I tell you, I'm feeding you rope. I'm here to help you. If you come to me and want to work, I'm glad to help you. But I feed them the rope, and I tell them it's up to you what you make with the rope.
Mhm.
You can either use it as a lifeline, or you can use it to really hurt yourself.
All right. Well, that was a long chapter. Next week, we're going to cover 2 judges, maybe even a third.
Well, yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, that might be possible. When you have a judge or two that only have 1 or 2 verses,
We go through them.
we'll have like
quickly.
a 5-minute class.
Yeah.
Yep.
Could do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other comments?
I was just going to say, Sam, it's amazing how evil he was. You know, when you talked about that he raised the city and then he sowed it with salt.
Yep.
You know, nothing would grow there for a long time. And
Yeah.
the same thing happened in the city of Babylon, which was foretold by the prophets that nothing would grow in Babylon.
Yeah.
And that happened naturally because the waters that ran through the city of Babylon, when it was basically, you know, when it was left vacant, washed all the paint off the walls, and those had nitrates in them that leached into the soil, and nothing to this day grows in Babylon. So very similar situation.
So I'm glad you brought that up because it jogged my memory. But Shechem is in ruins. It's left in ruins for 2 centuries. This is Bible trivia. Does anybody know who eventually comes along and rebuilds Shechem?
Would it be Solomon?
No, but you're close.
David?
No. Other direction in time.
Yeah.
Jeroboam.
Jeroboam. Yep. Once he is established as king in the north, one of the first things he does is he goes and rebuilds Shechem.
Would
So
that would likely be because of the Joshua's stone there being a significant place?
But then later, there's a place of worship built on Mount Gerizim. And remember, the Samaritan woman said, "Where should we worship? In the mountain of Jerusalem?" She's probably referring to that place. So it's just
Mount Gerizim.
Yeah, it's probably just a hotbed of idolatry, even though it's this central place of worship to God.
It makes you wonder with their idolatry. I once heard somebody talking about the different feasts in Israel and the different festivals. And, you know, we look at that and it doesn't compare to anything we do today because those feasts and festivals were meant to remind Israel of their story, of how they got to where they were. And it was a yearly reminder of that. And it makes you wonder, like when I look at the name Baal Berith, Lord of the Covenants, and I look at these different places of idolatry being set up in significant places represent Israel's history. It makes you wonder if they were just starting to slowly but surely change the story over time. And by the time you look back, you've gotten this far away from God. I don't know. It's just kind of interesting thought, I guess. The fact that they're setting all these things up in such close proximity to, you know, where they're establishing the old covenant.
Yeah. Well, you go to Israel now, it's a lot of, you've been there. Every place they think is a site of significance, there is a cathedral or some type of place of worship. They're doing the same thing.
True.
Yeah. But sadly, most of the places are inaccurate. They're the wrong spot. Yeah.
Yeah. You go to Israel and they're like, I don't know. They always say, "Oh, this is the proposed location."
Yeah. The suggested one.
Yeah.
1 of 6 possible.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
do you have any bright ideas?
No, not me. I'm all out of those. I'm going to say goodbye to YouTube.